Today I bring you the full assembly process of my LS1 engine. This engine was brought to my friends at Burnouts Machining in Indianapolis. Aaron, Doug, and Nikki did an outstanding job with getting this thing cleaned, machined, and ready to go. We start with this block, which has been cleaned, decked, and bored .030 over. A week prior to this assembly, we plastic gauged all the bearings for the rods and crank and inserted a new cam bearing with new cam and retaining plate. So let's dig into the rest of the big stuff. We start off with settling the crank with its bearings into the block. We've already tapped down the main caps and start inserting the main bolts and studs. Don't worry about the Milwaukee power tool. Its clutch is set to only 15 foot-pound, so there's no damage here. We'll go ahead and start the first pass of torquing down the mains. Inner bolt's first pass is 15 pound-feet. Working from the center cap, and then to cap 2, 4, 1, and 5. The first pass on the outer studs is also 15 pound-feet. We'll work them in the same pattern. The second pass of the inner bolts will be rotated at 110 degrees. This digital torque wrench has a degreeing mode on it, which is awesome for this sort of work. The second pass of the outer studs are rotated at 80 degrees. and then move on to the side main cap bolts. Some new bolts will come with sealer on them, or some sort of RTV. These are reused, so I'm adding RTV under the cap of the head of the bolt. Insert the bolt and finger tighten. Tighten the side main bolts at 22 pound-feet. The gang here at the shop have already matched and balanced the rotating assembly for me. Now we get the rings compressed and tap them down onto the block. With this particular ring compressor, it helps to put some firm downward force onto the sleeve to ensure smooth entry into the block. Using a wooden dowel or a rubber mallet, tap the cylinder to get it into the block. If there's a large amount of resistance, stop. Pull the piston back up to make sure you are not crushing the rings, and then try to reseat it. Take note to be careful as the rod gets closer to the crank, as you don't want any sharp edges to mar it up. Once the connecting rod with its bearing is placed over the crank, I then add on the end cap and finger tighten the bolts. Continue doing this for the other 7. Once all caps are snugged on by hand, turn over the block and start torquing the end caps. The first pass on these rods are 15 pound-feet. Depending on the year of your engine and bolts, your torque specs may be different. Double check the manufacturer guide or the GM service manual for your application. Now we'll degree the bolts for the connecting rods. In this instance, it's 60 degrees. Now we'll add the windage tray. Tighten the nuts on these studs down to 18 pound-feet. Rotate the block upright, and we'll start inserting the lifters with their guides. I went with the Delphi LS1 lifters, and these have been soaked for about 12 hours prior to installation. If you have access to a vacuum system, I highly recommend giving the lifters the oil bath vacuuming treatment to get all the air out. Unfortunately, I'll find out later on the first start that a single lifter was bad on arrival. More content on that one later. Place the lifters with their trays into the block, making sure that they're settled nicely into their holes. Insert the retaining bolt to each lifter guide and finger tighten. Then we'll go on to torque these to 106 pound-inch. Again, inch. These are small bolts, and you don't want to snap these off at this point. And since this block was machined, the locators were pulled out during that process, so we go ahead, place them back into the block, and tap them down firmly with a rubber mallet. Moving on to the front of the engine, we go ahead and place the cam gear with the timing chain. You want to have the dot on the crank facing straight up and the dot of the cam gear facing down. The dots will be pointing at each other. Finger tighten the 3 bolts, assuming you have a 3-bolt cam setup. I'm then visibly baffled that this block doesn't have provisions for a tensioner. We go ahead and torque down these cam bolts to 26 pound-feet. Here, I'm installing the new Melling high-pressure, regular volume oil pump. Flat side goes toward the front. It will not fit in the other direction with the pretty logo facing outward. Place the bolts in and finger tighten. Then proceed to torque the bolts to 18 pound-feet. With the block rotated and the bank of cylinders facing up, we put on the head gasket and then the head. This particular MLS gasket has front printed on one side. Even though the two gaskets are exactly the same, I'll still follow the directions. And then place the head on the block, lining up with the locator dowels. I decided to use OEM style head bolts as they're cheaper and will still hold plenty of power. We go ahead and place these in their respective holes, with the shorter ones being placed in the front and rear of the head. The small M8 bolts can also be placed in their holes towards the valley. We proceed to spin down these bolts to get them snug to the head, but don't tighten them. We'll get these torqued and degreed here shortly. And for your viewing pleasure, here's the torque sequence for the LS heads. This image was pulled from Summit Racing and is for the OEM head bolts. Again, check your bolt manufacturer's data sheet to ensure that you have the correct numbers. Following the sequence on the chart, the torque on the first pass of the M11 bolts is 22 pound-feet. On the second pass, we'll rotate the M11 bolts 90 degrees in the same pattern. With the thread locker on these bolts, it can be a struggle, especially on the engine stand. Having someone to hold it in place can help a lot. On the final pass, excluding the shorter M11 bolts in holes 9 and 10, rotate the bolts another 90 degrees. The bolts in positions 9 and 10 will get turned 50 degrees. On the M8 bolts in holes 11 through 15, torque them down to 22 pound-feet. We'll rotate the block over and do it again for the other side. I now have the rocker guide placed into the head, aligning it with its bolt holes. I then place the push rods down into their holes, making sure that the rod is seated into its lifter. Now the rocker arms can be placed into their guides, aligning the holes at the top of the arm with the push rod. The other fulcrum point of the arm is placed on the center of the top of the valve. I then proceed to spin down the bolts for the rocker arms. Some of these will have a little bit of spring tension in them from the valves to work through. You can also use a wrench to snug down these bolts or rotate the crank so that the cam can relieve some of that pressure, giving you enough space to tighten it down. I then go to the other side of the block and do the same for the other head. And I miss recording it on the first head, but be sure to use plenty of oil or assembly lube on these parts. And then once all these bolts are snugged down, but not tight yet, we can go ahead and start torquing them down to 22 pound-feet. So that's basically it for the long block assembly. Only things remaining are the front and rear covers with the respective gaskets. There are specialty tools which help align the covers as well as the main seals. I recommend using them. Stay tuned as I continue adding to this engine and get it in the G35 Drift Car. Be sure to subscribe to see more LS and drifting action. Thanks for watching.